Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute for Security Studies and this morning's seminar titled Insights into Policing in South Africa. We all are very aware of policing in South Africa in terms of what we read in the media. Recently we had the crime statistics released, which again drew attention to the police. And we are very fortunate today to have a colleague of mine, Dr. Andrew Fall, who used to work at the Institute for Security Studies and has been working ongoing on policing issues for some time, to talk about his recent book, which is based on his PhD research, which he did for Oxford University. And it really is quite an interesting and, I say, must-read work of policing literature in South Africa, because he gets down to the nitty-gritties of what police officials think about themselves, how they see the world, how they see the work they do, why they do what they do, and the various range of factors that influence them. We only really see policing when it makes it in the media, when there have been arrests made or when there's some kind of scandal going on. And the police officers we generally see on TV are usually the spokespeople or the senior generals, and we get caught up in that intrigue that's going on in South Africa for some time. But I think this book really gets into who are these men and women. And there are tens of thousands of them. We're looking at about 157,000 trained police officials who have different functions. They're detectives, they're on patrols, they work in crime intelligence, and they're mostly based at the 1,144 police stations across the country. Who are they? And what informs the work they do, and how do they see what they're doing? So I'm going to, in a second, have Andrew come up and just talk a bit about his research. We will then, but later, be joined by the president of the South African Police Union, Mpho Kunika, and he's going to speak a bit about what he thinks is important for policing. And I'm going to very, very briefly, also as part of the seminar, just talk a bit about the importance of police leadership. We've been doing a lot of work on this in the last year or so. And really, at the end of the day, if you really want to fix a police organization, you have to start at the top. These are very hierarchical organizations. The National Commission has immense power to determine what happens, when it happens, who gets deployed where, the tone of policing, the model of policing. And so I'll talk a bit about that. And that might make some sense as to why what happens at the ground also happens at that level. Before we start, I just want to let you know that the seminar is being live streamed, so people are tuning in from different parts of the world. Once we've had the presentations, we will then end the live streaming part, and we'll take questions and discussions based on anything you'd like to talk about. And in that session, we use the Chatham House rules, which simply means that you can't attribute anything anybody said in that session unless you've got their permission beforehand. I would like to thank our donors, particularly the Hans Seidel Foundation, which funds a lot of our police work. It's funding this event today. And they also fund our Crime and Justice Information Analysis Hub, where you can get a lot more information about police performance, the crime statistics. As it comes out, we update that as we get new information. Also, the Open Society Foundation also funds some of our work on criminal justice. So I'd like to thank them. In addition to them, the German Federal Foreign Office and the members of our ISS Partnership Forum, which are the governments of Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, Japan, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United States of America. On your seat, you'll see a short feedback form. We would appreciate it if you take just a minute to fill that in and leave it on your seats when you leave. We always like to hear what you have to say, and it helps us improve our events if we can.
And within Cape Town, there are some stations that sometimes record no murder in a year, and there are others that will record almost 300. So I'm at one of the upper end township stations, which I was interested in because I think that kind of mythology filters out into broader South African life. We're not all living in stations where there are 10 murders every weekend in the surrounding communities, but we are aware of these ideas of risk and danger, and we feed them into our own lives and our understanding of police. Then a rural town. I'd never had any exposure to rural policing. This was in the Eastern Cape. It's a town of about 100,000, I think. And outside of that, I worked at a rural village station, which is in the middle of nowhere, quote unquote, tiny little villages. The station was in one village, and there were about 17 other villages in the 500 square kilometer boundary that this station, which had one van, was responsible for policing. So quite a diversity of space. And in my previous research, I'd always only focused on patrol officers and uniformed officers. And in this research, I spent time with detectives as well. So I've tried to incorporate that in. So why identity? I start the preface in the book, by saying that when I finished high school in the late 90s, I wanted to be a police officer. And I guess the way I frame it is I was from this liberal white English family. Everybody was happy that apartheid was over and there was this rainbow nation mythology and everyone had great opportunities and the future was going to be grand and better. But crime was threatening the new democracy. Crime was going to chase investors away and chase wealthy people away with their money. And Pachad in Cape Town was also bombing police stations, so I felt like there was this call for me to go and contribute and through policing help make the South African dream come true. Whether that narrative that I play in my head now is true to the 18-year-old Andrew Fall in 1998, whether or not that's true, we can't test right now. As I will describe, identity isn't a fixed thing. We're constantly telling ourselves stories about our pasts, and we're using those stories to populate our imagined futures. And the stories are always changing. In that I'm standing here talking about police, it's convenient for me to hold on to this idea that once upon a time I wanted to be a cop. The 20th century, a few things. We think we can't imagine countries and cities without police. Police are less than 200 years old in terms of publicly funded, uniformed people who are meant to serve everybody. Similarly, you meet somebody today, you ask them, what do you do? This idea that you have an occupation, and to that occupation, your identity is linked. I'm a nurse, I'm a social worker, I'm a teacher, I'm a truck driver. Again, that identity occupation link didn't exist in the way it does today before the 20th century, really. And in the South African context, the new South African narrative was about most South Africans have been denied occupational identities that have particular levels of status, and the new era was going to do away with that. There's a long-established literature dating back 70 years focusing on police organizational culture. This has looked at what kind of values and perceptions manifest in police organizations, and how do those impact the way police do their work. It started in the US and the UK in terms of the English language literature. I'll talk a bit more about it soon. But this is something I've always been interested in my reservist work. When I first started doing reservist work and reading the literature on organizational culture, I could immediately see these traits that I'm reading about in American police and British police are clearly evident in the SAPs. And those traits do shape the way police work is done. So whether you're a teacher or a social worker or a nurse or a police officer, your personal views about things will fracture and fragment and change the way that the normative ideals, the Constitution of South Africa, the Domestic Violence Act, the Child Justice Act, those things might be great at one level, but they have to pass through a human being before they are brought to life on the street. And if I'm a cop who believes that children should be beaten, then when somebody tries to say this child is being abused, I might come and say, no, that child needs to learn respect for his parents. So that's one of the reasons the cultural element has been so popular in police sociology. But individual narratives inform organizational narratives. I certainly agree that an organizational culture has more power to shape the actions of people working in the organization. People don't join the SAPs to say, I'm going to go into the SAPs and I'm going to change everything about policing. I'm going to make sure my values inform this organization. Rather, I go in and I say, thank goodness I've got a job. What do they want me to do? How do they want me to see the world? That is more common. But I think what I try to do in this book is say there is relevance in individual officers' narratives. It is valuable to consider the SAPs in the broader context of South Africa and in the journeys that South Africans are on, which sometimes lead to working for the SAPs. So some of the themes, which I'm not going to get to, the meta-narrative that I'll quickly describe, which we can come back to during the Q&A if there's something here which we don't get to. The idea that South Africa is a land of hope and precarity. Precarity infers life without predictability. Most people's lives are very precarious. You are born into relative poverty. The education you get isn't great. The people around you don't have good occupational networks that they can use to introduce you to work that will be rewarding and financially generous. So there's both this idea that the future's great, but there's also this reality that it's difficult to tie down the South African dream and live it. I talk in chapter 2 about the good shift. What kind of ideals what do police imagine a good shift looking like on the streets in the 4 different areas? So how are wealthy people policed? How are poorer people policed? How are rural people policed? And I'll talk a bit about that in this presentation. I follow that with police deception. The organizational culture literature is replete with ideas that police put on front stage performances. Policing is in many ways theatre. It's a political theatre. The police are the most visible representatives of the state. Their cars are visible. They've got lights. They've got uniforms. All sorts of symbolic insignia. But they're also asked all over the world to do the impossible. Police by themselves cannot prevent crime in a very ill or structurally fragmented society. And because police all over the world face this impossible mandate, the theatre sometimes takes precedence. So in the South African context, visible policing is this idea that is easy to sell to South Africans. We want to see police, and if we see police, there won't be crime because we're all rational offenders, and where there are police, we can't commit crime. The logic doesn't hold up when you interrogate it, but I explore some of the backstage things that go on in the South African Police Service. I then take a look at individual narratives. What are the life stories that police tell themselves about themselves, and how do those get carried into the organization? How do those link to feeling ambition, what I want to achieve in my life, feelings of shame where I've failed, and violence on the job and respect? Transgressions, coercion, and hope. So bad things police do, hope for the future, and pulling the threads together. So, common themes in police officers' self-narratives. Again, these themes are relevant probably to many South Africans or most South Africans, but I'm trying to highlight them and then say, what does this mean for policing in South Africa? So, most people are born into relative poverty. Many South Africans are exposed to violence at an early age, whether it's in the home, the primary school, seeing people fighting outside, whether perpetrating violence themselves. People are born in schools that do still sell the South African dream. Schools do, and perhaps rightfully so, tell children, remain optimistic. If you work hard in school, you can be whatever you want to be. This is a new country. Things were hard for our parents, but you will reap what you sow, really. So police have worked hard to finish school already. 45% of people who start school in South Africa don't finish matric. You have to have matric to enter the police, so you already have proven your resilience by getting your matric certificate. However, lots of cops would have worked hard at school, and because they've worked hard at school, because they've been top students, they have thinking, okay, now I'm going to go to university, I'm going to pursue engineering, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be X and Y. But they finish and they realize the money to study isn't there, or the township school I attended hasn't actually given me the academic skills to function in this university environment. Much like there are clear connections here to the fees and the free quality decolonized education now type calls. This idea that university shouldn't be this hard. I did everything right as a teenager. I've beaten the odds. Why am I not able to succeed here? And as a result, I describe many officers' lives as accidental officers. So they finished school, they've maybe started their degrees but been unable to finish for academic reasons, for money reasons. And then looking around and saying, okay, well, what is this very exclusionary market going to offer me? What can I do now that I don't have a tertiary degree? Or even if I do have a tertiary degree, there are surprisingly many SAPS members who have secured degrees, and then they still enter the market and they don't have networks of people in organizations who can offer them jobs. There are just not enough jobs. It's difficult to get your foot in the door. And so people often find themselves applying to the South African Police Service. And I think this is important because it's a point at which the imagined ideal of one's self-narrative, this idea that I'm working hard at school, I'm doing everything right, I'm going to succeed as an engineer or this or that. And I've probably not liked the police as a teenager because I liked drinking and they used to shut down the shebeen or something like that. And now suddenly I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I'm applying to this organization which is stigmatized in many communities, which people say bad things about. And then getting into the organization, I think I might have been missing a slide. But anyway, I'll say some stuff, and if it comes up later, I'll brush over it. But getting into the organization, firstly, last year, or the most recent annual report's just come out, but the previous annual report mentioned that the SAPS advertised something like 3,000 posts in the previous financial year, and they received over 200,000 applications, and they hired 2,500 odd. So you have a less than 2% chance of getting into the SAPS as an applicant, which means it's harder to get into the SAPS than it is to get into Harvard or Oxford or the best universities in the world. Of course, to get into those universities, you have to have met the criteria first. But it requires an inordinate amount of luck. And so getting in there and saying, okay, actually this organization isn't so bad. I grew up with everyone cursing police in the neighborhood. My father told me how he was detained as a young person. But actually this organization has all sorts of opportunities. I can be a helicopter pilot, I can be a diver, I can be a cook, I can be a trainer. It's kind of it provides a cocoon in which suddenly those dreams of the future and what I might accomplish are brought to life again. The salaries that are paid by the SAPS are also, by South African standards, very good. A starting salary of around 40, well, if I look at the 2010 data, we have the census data. The average household income in 2010 was just over 100,000 Rand. And I think a constable's starting salary was about the same. But of course, these averages are misleading because we have such an unequal country. If you look at the average black male-headed household in 2010, the average income was 66,000 Rand or thereabouts, or 60,000. So in that, most of the SAPS, most of South Africa, would be classified black African. Getting a job as a constable means that you're almost immediately earning twice the average household income in the country, and it's all yours. You might have a partner who's also in the SAPS, and then you're earning 4 times the average household income. And that kind of sets off alarm bells. Okay, this isn't so bad. Maybe I can live a good life here. However, simultaneously, people think, oh wow, this is a great opportunity for me. I can make my dreams come true, possibly. But then there's, for most South Africans, people are wed to networks of socially precarious kin, family, friends, and the salary, which would be great if you were a 18 or 19-year-old SAPS officer just coming out of school, it would be a lot of money and you could do great things if it was all yours to build a life with. It means very little if you're being recruited at the age of 29, you've already got 2 children, they might be living in different provinces, your parents are unemployed, your brother-in-law has just been fired. Everybody wants a piece of your pie, and it's difficult, I think, for people to say, no, I'm not going to share my money. And as a result, the dreams that the salary might be able to offer me, where everybody else around me employed, are often pulled down and are unmet because of my family. And as a result, cops who do start to think, okay, maybe I'm not going to be able to climb to the top of this organization. Of course, it's a hierarchical organization. Everybody starts hoping that they will climb to the top, but the nature of police hierarchies is that most people will always remain at the bottom. And as a result, police often end up deferring their dreams to their children. So they might saying, okay, I might not be able to reach my dreams, but I've got this income. I can send my child to a slightly better school than the one I was sent to, and my child can live the South African dream that I've not been able to live. Okay, I'm quite confident now that one of my slides is missing. So that was where I was going to touch on the concepts. I just want to recap a couple of the concepts. there's this term ontological security which I use, and I make the claim in the book that this might be the first time that policing and police organizations have been looked at through the lens of ontological security. This is being the idea that the fundamental existential questions about life are clear in your head. The narrative you tell yourself is steady and stable and secure. You're not waking up every day anxious about what's my sexual orientation, what do my neighbors think of me, why am I unable to have a child, am I ever going to find work, all these kind of things that can cause us all lots of strain. Once we've got a steady job, we're clear who we like, who our friends are, we can imagine the future 5 years from now, we can look back on our past favorably. We get to create this clear, stable narrative. And I counter that with this concept precarity that I mentioned, suggesting that South Africa is a very precarious place. Most people's lives are characterized by precarity. And so there's a bit of a contest between ontological security. We're all trying to sort things out in our head by sorting out our material world, but we're constantly weighed down by the context of one of the most unequal and violent societies in the world. So, how do these key themes that I've touched on shape the way that police practice occurs on the street? Again, these are broad brush strokes. There are many exceptions, but I think in general there's truth in this. The job is to be coveted. People enter the organization. Hang on. I forgot my book is here. Before, no, I'm just going to read a few examples of narratives that show the traits that I was just talking about, common themes. So this is, I'm describing sitting around a table with 4 student constables. They're towards the end of their 2 years of training. They're filling in their pocketbooks. We're just talking about life and what they think of the SAPs. 2 of the cops have just made jokes about the police salary is fine as long as you're not a baby factory having babies all over. Then a woman, those 2 were men, and then a female constable asked me if I had children. She was surprised when I said I did not. I have one, she volunteered. She's 4 years old. Constable Debeza was in her early 20s. I asked if she would like her child to join the SAP someday. She exploded in exaggerated gasps. Yo, no. If so, I asked, why had she joined? Job scarcity, she replied. Most of those in our intake joined because of job scarcity. They didn't want to be police, but once you are in there, you start to like it and develop a passion. She continued, reflecting on this change in herself. It's strange when you go from shouting at police to liking the police. I was shouting at the police before I joined, when they closed the tavern, when we were still having a good time. Now I won't. It was wrong. And I will tell my sister not to shout at police either. So this is where I talk about a shift in narrative. She was somebody who didn't like police. She's now in the police, and she says, oh, bad me, I shouldn't have dissed this organization. And I'm going to try and tell my friends and community not to diss the organization either. Of course, when one's personal identity is wed to occupation, you want to protect the image of that occupation. This is another narrative of a cop working in one of the rural stations. Here I want to hint at both the idea of aspiration, class migration, and being exposed to violence. So what does it mean when you're raised with violence? You're exposed to all sorts of violence, and where does that fit in your understanding of the South African Police Service? So he says, I'm from a village in Patterson. I grew up with, which is the big town I was based at in the Eastern Cape. I grew up with my mother, brothers, and sisters, and attended my local village school. Halfway through high school, I moved to a school closer to Patterson. It had a better matric pass rate. It's a common trend in the area, everyone moving to attend better schools. There are schools that have closed down because everyone leaves. My first school used to have about 1,000 students. Now it only has something like 190. So here I'm just indicating there are various things, ways in which we as South Africans indicate class migration. If a coloured South African in Cape Town moves to a formerly white area, it signals an ascent. If a black South African moves from a township school to a formerly coloured school, it signals assent. Here he's suggesting the schools in my area were running out of students because everybody was aspiring to the stream. All parents were trying to send their children to the best possible high schools. After school, I moved to Woodside, another big town, a bigger town in the Eastern Cape, and a much more affluent town, the name of which I've changed. I moved there to study financial management at an FET college. It was a 2-year course, but after 1.5 years, I decided to drop out. He talks about living in the township outside the school, having to walk for an hour in the evening to get to class, then having to walk home and study for tests the next day, and he couldn't take the strain. So again, this precarity that is common to so many South Africans' lives. So he talks about he dropping out of the degree, phoning the police. I kept my phone on all month waiting for them to call, but they didn't. So it's another common story is I applied to the SAPS 5 times before I got a phone call. That kind of fishing line that pulled me out of this precarity. But he talked about the violence that he was exposed to at the time that he was doing this tertiary study. He said, while living there, I was shot at, chased with pangas, chased with an okapi knife, the scar on my arm, he had a big scar. I've changed the location of the scar because I'm anonymizing people. But he had a big scar. The scar on my arm, I was coming home from a club and I saw these people fighting over a lady. I tried to break them up and one of them stabbed me in the arm. Then they laughed, stopped fighting and left. I was just trying to help her. He then talks about various other violent incidents that he was exposed to, including how he had planned to stab somebody as a revenge attack for having robbed him a few days before. I asked him if he had reported any of these incidents to police, and he said no. And the way he answered it was, why would anybody report these things to police? Even as a police officer now, it didn't seem to occur to him that that's what should happen. And I think this perception is quite common in South Africa. We seek individual justice in our home communities through violence, through threats, through verbal fights, fist fights. So I talk in the book, I'm not going to talk about it now, but there were police who would come to work at times with black eyes and fat lips because they had sought individual justice in punch-ups with their neighbors and the like. Again, none of them saying, I'm a police officer, I should resolve these things through the formal criminal justice system. Reflecting on how he went from studying at the FET college to joining the police and reflecting on his past, he says, I didn't enjoy my course in Woodside, but I had never imagined joining the police either. When you're growing up, you think of being a nurse or a teacher or a lawyer, never a cop. But now I'm in the SAPS, I've grown to like this job. I enjoy it. Now that I'm here, there are so many options. You can be a cook, a sports trainer, a teacher. I got lucky getting this job. I got lucky. He ended this little conversation by saying, he talks about how he needs to buy a car soon because he's a constable and he needs to buy a car, and the relevant car for his rank would be a Polo. So there's this idea of status. How do I indicate my status? What can I consume to move away from this precarious past? He ends by saying, I don't have a wife or children yet, but I do have to pay for my family. The more money you have, the more problems you have, which is what I was hinting at earlier. He's made it. This idea, he can buy himself a shiny new Polo, but he's got a family. His extended family needs his support. So there's that constant counterbalance. The last example, similar themes, and a connection to violence and respect. I'm driving around in the township station in Cape Town. I'm asking the 2 constables I'm with if they think the community respects them. They say no, not at all. I ask why. They tell me it's because police don't have the power to shoot anymore. All their powers have been taken away. No one respects them. He had also moved from a rural area to Cape Town to finish high school and then to study, and he had dropped out of an engineering degree partway through and ended up in the police. He talked about wanting to get out of the SAPS. Many cops, as I say, I think most didn't necessarily plan to leave. They thought, this is great, I'm going to try and hold on, unless a clear, better remunerated job occurs elsewhere. So I do think most were invested in the organization. But what was I going to say? I wanted to talk about the people he grew up with. So growing up in Khayelitsha, he said He lived in Site C, one of the poorest sections of Cape Town's largest township. He said he enjoyed the area, but lamented that many of his school peers had become scollies. Some had even been arrested for murder or killed by each other, he said. Although he still lived in Khayelitsha, he avoided his old friends. Then talking about respect. It would be fine if I was a captain. At least then I would be respected by the other members. I would like to work at a senior level in the forensics lab, but I also enjoy the action of police work. When I arrest people, I have to struggle with them, but once I have them in the cells, I give them advice, tell them to take short courses to improve their chances of employment, and in the morning they thank me, or when they see me in the streets, they salute me. It was a short tale of a police officer who felt unappreciated of force used to restrain and advice offered. Most importantly, it was about earning the respect of men who had previously shown none. So what I wanted to highlight in that last narrative is that many SAPS officers are raised with violence, but are also raised with the people who they are later pitted against. So some of his friends had been arrested for murder. Some of his friends had committed other crimes. And this has a bearing on personal identity, because I see a reflection of myself. This young man has faced the same hardship that I've faced. I've been lucky enough to get in here. Some people might put us together and say we're both young black South African men and generalize about us and think that we are threats. And as a result, I think that leads to a particular dynamic in poor areas in particular, where police are policing people who remind them of themselves, rather than in wealthier areas where they're policing people whose quality of life they would like to attain. How much time do I have? Okay. Okay. Oh, thank you. So, what I started touching on earlier, how do these things shape policing? The job is coveted. I get in there, it's really great. I might really enjoy the work. I might be doing the best I can do, but I also need to please the managers, because I don't want my life to be more complicated than it is. So if my managers tell me to go outside and search 40 people, I will do that, or I will report that I've searched 40 people even if I haven't. There's a problem in both of them. One is constantly stopping and searching people is quite an aggressive interaction between the state and its citizens. Thank you. The other is my superiors expect me to stop and search everybody. It's not practical to do that, so I will just report that I have, and those numbers will be added together and put in the front page of the SAPS annual report at the end of the year. There are different problems at different levels. There's also a fiction at the heart of policing. This is a fiction that exists everywhere in the world, and it goes back to this idea of the impossible mandate that Johannes talked about in South Africa and Peter Manning in the US, that we do project too much onto police. We expect them to do all sorts of things that they can't do. They're kind of like an ambulance service for all things state-related. In South Africa, because crime and violence are so pervasive, we often just say, police, you need to solve this. And because everywhere in the world police are limited in what they can do, there's some good stuff they can do. They can do focused work, they can do geographic work, they can do particular offender-based interventions, but they can't say, we're going to stop all burglary in Greater Pretoria. And as a result, and this is a theme in police sociology all over the world, police perform these front stage performances. They will drive around randomly, even if the evidence suggests that random patrol does very little to reduce crime. They will stop and search people who they have been told are the kinds of people who look suspicious, even if those interactions communicate to those young men, usually, that the state doesn't care about you, or that the state suspects you, and that internalization can then leave that person down a road that might lead to crime, it might lead to hardship, it might lead to mental health issues. And that's what I've just said. So there's this front stage political theatre that's put on for the public, and then there's a backstage where the corners are cut, so the figures are inputted for things that didn't take place necessarily. People who are arrested who aren't necessarily abused in public space, where people might be filming them and the like, might be abused in the cells because this is police space, it's out of public view. again, I'm not saying that everybody taken into a police cell or even 10% of people taken into a police cell are getting abused, but there were clear incidences where if somebody need only say, "Why are you arresting me?" and he would be slapped in the face. And because everybody's holding on to this job, it's not in my interest to hold my colleague accountable for slapping the guy in the face, even if I think it's wrong, because I don't want to make trouble for myself. This job means a lot to me. This job means a lot to my family. I'll skip over the policing across space. I'll summarize it quite quickly. But what I want to emphasize is that what I found is that police reproduce levels of order and disorder in the spaces they work. So at an ideal level, police are going out into cities, into countrysides, and they're saying, this is the rule of law, and everybody abides by the rule of law, and we treat everybody equally, and we abide by the letter of the law. But that's not what we see. We see policing taking place very differently in rural areas, in townships, and in affluent areas. And my core argument is that in the countryside and the township, police are more likely to feel comfortable, and they're more likely to have ideas about, I know these people because I'm like these people, so my violence is justified, my judgments are justified. Whereas in middle class or affluent space, they're more likely to temper their behavior. So in the township station, it was common for police to drive through red lights and to throw litter out the window, things that they wouldn't do in middle class space. So rather than the police shaping the space, the police are being shaped by the space. And in such an unequal country, that means the reproduction of apartheid era space and order, which isn't what we want from police. So a meta-narrative is people moving from the countryside, bringing violence from the countryside, or being born in townships and therefore lacking the social rural values that they should have gotten. And the aspiration for police and for everybody in the South African dream type narrative is that we will all enter affluent space. But the reality for police and for the people they are engaging with often is a loop between countryside and township. So I live and work in the township or in a working class area of a South African city. I hope to move into better areas. I go home to my rural home during the December holidays, and there's this loop rather than the country getting better or lives getting better. Although, as I've said, people's lives certainly are getting better through working with the SAPs. Okay, I'm not going to talk in detail about policing across space. Another example, I talked a bit about major themes in personal narratives. I'm just going to talk about an example of a slightly misleading organizational narrative, which then feeds into personal identity. And this is one of the things South Africans love to talk about, police murders. So every couple of years, there's a big moral rage, outcry, media storm about the rate at which police officers are being killed. South Africa has a big problem with police officers being killed. It is terrible. I mean, I'm sure many of you would have seen the video of the JMPD officer last week being disarmed by angry churchgoers. It was horrendous. It's kind of, they did not recognize any form of legitimacy in his uniform, in his standing, in the fact that he was shooting a gun in the air. We have big problems. But every few years we're told that murders are out of control, and the reality is we're at the lowest times in post-apartheid history in terms of police deaths. There are, 250% fewer police murders now than there were in the early 90s. And yet, if the organization is going, we're all being killed, how do individual officers integrate that idea, that risk, that this idea that the community isn't supporting us? How does that shape their individual views? Then hidden narratives, some of the things that aren't as, well, I would say there's no comparison in how little they filter into the public domain. If you look at the ways in which police officers are dying, being murdered on duty is one of the least likely. You probably can't see this in detail. Okay, so there's murder, vehicle accidents, other incidents, and suicide. People are generally far more likely to die in a vehicle accident than they are to be murdered. They're almost as likely to kill themselves as they are to be murdered. And in all instances, they are more likely to die off duty. So very few people are dying, are being murdered on duty compared to off duty. many more are dying in car accidents off duty than on duty. And I think that something that this reveals, which we should acknowledge, it doesn't really matter about whether this SAPS is hiding this, but what we need to acknowledge is these deaths, the violence. Police are going home to the violence. Police are going home to disorderly driving. These things that police ideally would be working against in their jobs are still informing their lives at home. I would often talk to cops. One of my gripes and one of the things that first struck me when I started doing reservist duty was realizing, firstly, that everyone's got a lock on their cupboard, so no one trusted their colleagues not to steal their coffee and things, which blew my bubble about these are all the best, most reputable people ever. But also the fact that SAPS officials almost never wear seatbelts, will often speed, not indicate, things like that. This idea that traffic order has no implications for greater order. And I would ask officials during this research, I see you like to speed, I see you like to drive like this. Do you drive differently when you're in your private vehicle? And they would go, oh, I've never thought of it, but no, you can't turn it off. So it's this idea that the organization is teaching you to work with violence in particular ways, to drive cars in particular ways, and you're taking those attitudes and experiences back into your private life. And I suspect that is informing everybody dying in car accidents, being murdered off duty. It's not the answer, but I think these are the kinds of narratives that are hidden, although this was presented in Parliament. So it's obviously out there. It's just not receiving the same attention. So police deaths are at an all-time low. More police are killed off duty than on. Many more police are killed in car accidents than are murdered. Many police kill themselves. How does the "they are out to kill us" narrative shape officers' identities? Why are police dying? Because they live in precarious, violent areas. They're accustomed to using violence. Police are accustomed to ignoring road rules, driving recklessly. Police often support many people, which adds to stress, access to firearms, and suicide. And that's, I think, this last bit, I talk about liminality in the book, this idea that I'm almost on track to live the South African dream, but now everybody wants a piece of my police salary pie, and what does this mean, and what are my obligations, and this is so difficult, and I get exposed to all sorts of stress every day in my job. I have a firearm on the side. It's easy to kill myself, which is obviously very concerning. So, to wrap things up, who do they think they are and how does it shape their practice? Unsurprisingly, they are average South Africans invested in a dream of a better future, making their way from the periphery of a very violent, unequal society, looking for a better life. At times they're proud by the work they do. They do think this organization could be great. They do think they can do good work. At other times they're shamed by the work they do. They're shamed by trying to shut down a shebeen when nobody wants to respect their presence and people throw rocks at their cars. They're shamed by the idea that before I joined, I used to shout at police. I know what people say about police, and I know these people might be saying it about us now, even though we're trying to do a good thing here. In the meantime, they put their heads down, focus on their lives, and that can include ignoring abuses, not standing up to colleagues, because life in South Africa is difficult and you don't want to make it any more difficult for yourself than it need be. This often leads to the reproduction of apartheid-era access to public goods and to safety. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. So there you have it in terms of a brief summary of a lot more information, a lot more interesting stories told by police officials in the book, and it's you can't really do justice to the level of detail in that, but it just gives you a sort of peek into the life of different police in different kind of circumstances and how they get there. And one of the things we've been looking at is, if you are a police constable or a police official at one of these police stations in different places around the world, country, and this idea that you want to get up, you want to move on in the police organization, one of the big issues, obviously, is, who gets to become the top cops? Who gets into that top echelon? And how do they get there, and what do they need to do to get there? We've been particularly worried about this issue because, as you all know, for the last 2 years, there's been only acting people in the position of National Commissioner. It's an organization that's incredibly hierarchical. So the person who occupies that top post ideally should be a man or woman who all these thousands of police officials look up to and say, well, I can be there one day if I work hard, if I follow the prescripts, the law, if I make sure that I do the best I can, that's available. And as you know, that's not always the case. In most cases, it isn't the case. But really, how the police national commissioner gets chosen and how that top echelon get appointed and what's expected of them will shape the overall organization. Because if you think about the organization, there are 32 lieutenant generals. Their primary responsibility is to make sure that the 87 billion rand they received this year is going in the right way, it's been spent in the right way to provide the police the kind of training they need, the resources they need to do the jobs they're expected to do, and that when they're not doing that, they are held accountable so that they don't undermine public trust in the police, and if they are doing what they're supposed to do, that there are promotions, that there's a good long career ahead of them, because it is a stable form of employment. And that's why we think that's the police leadership issue is so critically important. And very quickly to speak to some of these issues before I hand over to Mpo Nkonika from SAPU. Differently, they see themselves as a role model, so they are the police official that everybody should be aspiring to be, so that when you see how they dress, how they speak to people, that they adhere to the rules, that they become the role model for the organization. They set the tone. They're good communicators. They can speak clearly to police officials, to the public. They can communicate what's needed to be done in a way that everybody understands. They're critical and creative thinkers, because the challenges facing the police change all the time. They're not just doing the same old thing. They are able to think through what do we need to do differently to improve things and respond to new challenges that emerge organizationally and in the society they work. They need to be able to make decisions, and it's not just that they can make decisions, it's that they have a clear idea about how they get to a decision. And that means that they recognize they don't know everything, because policing has so many different functions. Detective work is different to visual policing, different to forensics. So they're willing to listen to and point people around them and know what they're doing and listen to them, and then take the management cohort to a place where they all agree on the decision. So it's a process of making decisions. Not, I'm in charge, I'm just make the decision and you all have to follow it and I don't care what you think about it. They must be then seen as a trustworthy, and of course that gives them legitimacy, so that everybody doesn't question why is this person the national commissioner, because they possess these characteristics and qualities. So clearly integrity is crucial. At least 3 of these characteristics talk about integrity. So if you are the president in South Africa and you want to appoint the police chief, here are the criteria we suggest you look at. And of course, the president has huge power in policing appointments. So he appoints the Minister of Police, and he appoints the National Commissioner, and the head of the Hawks, and all these other people. But this is the interesting thing. This is the interesting thing. To be a constable, and then this is was released by, spoken to a bit about Andrew. It's not actually that easy. These are the 18 formal criteria that you need to meet to become a constable. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they say at least must be 25 years old, not over the age of 40. You have to have your health assessed, your competencies assessed, be subject to various assessments. You must at least have a matric and driver's license, read and write 2 official languages, one of which must be English. So there's actually quite a lot. Go through vetting. So there's pretty much 18 different criteria. The one is, don't have a tattoo that is visible, for example. So it's quite detailed. But if the president decides he wants to make anybody else, he's got criteria, the legal criteria for the national commissioner. These are the legal criteria that the president is guided by. You must simply be over the age of 18, a South African citizen by birth, and not have a criminal record. So the president can literally throw a dart at the telephone book. And most people would be over 18 if they have a telephone account, probably don't have a criminal record, and are South Africans. And that has allowed for the president to appoint people based on a whole lot of criteria which you and I are completely not privy to. But it has resulted in some severe problems. Here's a few of them. And that has resulted in the senior police official for the last 17 years of South Africa's police democracy not being a person who is a trained, effective police commander. And as we can see, being jailed for corruption, being found to be dishonest and lacking competency, and then being recommended to be fired, maladministration, being fired, criminal prosecution while being suspended on the sick pay. This is the head of intelligence. So we're just talking about, if you're a police officer who joins an organization, believes you want to fight crime, these are the people that you should be putting in jail. And they are more powerful than you, earn the big salaries, and tell you what to do. Okay, so what is the impact of this? So when the top echelon of the police lose the trust of their own people, lose the trust of the public, what happens? Well, we can see, and people and the police always complain they don't have enough resources. In many cases, if you go to police stations, it's true, they don't. It's not that the organization doesn't have enough resources. It's that the systems for identifying where those resources need to go don't work. It's not that there aren't 55,000 vehicles in the South African Police Service. It's just they're not being allocated effectively and properly. So lieutenant generals have their own vehicles that be driven around by drivers. But a constable who's got to go out and give service to a village in the rural Eastern Cape has to share a van with the entire police station. So the budget for the South African Police Service has gone up by 50% to the current amount of 87 billion rand. This is almost unheard of anywhere in the world to see this kind of increase in the last 5 years, especially since the 2009 crisis. Most European and Western agencies, you see decline in the policing budgets, actually. So this is not, so we see that we are giving above inflation increases to the South African Police Service. But because of this leadership crisis, the systems for making sure that the police are properly trained, held accountable, doing the right thing, are falling apart. The National Development Plan calls it a serial crisis of top management in the police. And so for the last 5 years, and these don't include the most recent annual reports. I've just got the reports. I haven't updated these things, so there might be changes there. I'm sure there are. But just a few indicators. This is the detection rates for violent crime. So you can see the detection rate is the proportion of cases that the police receive that they're able to identify a perpetrator or close the cases unfounded. So they know what happened there and who they're looking for. Overall, for violent crime, it's dropped from 60.7% contact crime to 36.9%. Murder and robbery for most of the last 5 years have all been declining. Okay, so that's in the same period with the police being more resources, they are able to identify fewer and fewer perpetrators. Part of the problem, I don't know the stats here, but about crime intelligence. Crime intelligence is supposed to provide crime threat analysis to police stations, is supposed to be able to identify the criminal networks, so help the police detectives and others identify who they're actually trying to arrest. Our policemen and women should not be out there policing all 36 million adults or all 55 million people in the country. They should be focusing their resources on those people who commit serious, violent, or repeat crimes. And that's not everybody. That's probably not even 5% of the population. So you're driving around randomly, you're trying to police everybody. If you're stopping every young man you see in the street, you're going to make 1.5 million arrests. But if you want to bring crime down, identify the people committing the crimes. This is just looking at crimes we all know are very serious in South Africa. Prevention Organised Crime Act in 2015-16, 13 cases, 10 arrests, 4 convictions. I know this looks differently now because I managed to look at this recently. It's gone up quite dramatically, by the way, fortunately. But last year it looked terrible. Same thing, Prevention Corruption Combating Act, 58 cases and 11 convictions. These 2 pieces of legislation were passed by Parliament to make it easier for the police to investigate and prosecute these kinds of crimes. Roadblocks and cordons, again, you see reductions in the numbers there. This is the reduction in the Hawks. 2011-12, 14,793 arrests and 7,000 convictions. In 2015, it was down to 5,800 arrests, 1,176 convictions. So that's generally kind of performance. And then, of course, conduct has been a problem because when your systems of accountability are not working effectively, cops tend to, at a grassroots level, make illegal arrests and do a whole lot of other things that they shouldn't be doing. And there's now industry growing in South Africa to get civil claims because people don't report to the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, or they make complaints to police, they don't get any response, and now they're going to the courts. And a lot of those resources that should be going to policing are now increasingly going to paying out civil claims. There's 175% in the year ending 2015 and 16. So it's almost 300 million rand a year being paid out once a judge has looked at the evidence and said, yes, a police officer on the balance of probability has committed a wrong against the civilian, and I'm going to award costs. And so this is a growing problem for the police. And reductions, and in terms of sort of people's trust in the police, we've seen reduction in people saying that the police are doing a good job, and the victims of crime survey showing, for example, the numbers of people who said they were victims of sexual assault and then reported to the police dropping substantially, also between the period of 2013 and 2016. So people are simply not reporting certain crimes to the police, which means when the police statistics come out and they say, we're doing a fantastic job on sexual offences because the sexual offences numbers have dropped, it's not that they've actually dropped, it's that the victims are not reporting these cases anymore because they don't believe anything's going to happen to them. And then the public impact on public safety. The murders, we know, after a really long period of almost 18 years of reductions in murders consistently, we've seen big increases. almost 3,500 murders more last year than the case 5 years ago, and almost 40,000 more armed robberies last year than the case 5 years ago. And armed robberies are a crime that if the police have a focused strategy or using crime intelligence effectively can really bring down. In Gauteng, not using all the resources, actually quite a small proportion of the resources in 2009 managed to bring hijacking down by 32%, house robberies down by 20%, and business robbery down by 19% in 2 years. And there were particularly there was about 460 cops working on that specific strategy on those crimes. Because they were using intelligence effectively, they identify the networks, the people involved, and they managed to arrest them and bring it down. So I know the police have the skill, there are police officers with the skills, with experience, with the knowledge, and the resources to get on top of this problem. So we shouldn't be seeing this. Okay, I'm not going to go into much longer there. But ultimately, the solution is to start at the top, and the National Development Plan, which was adopted by Cabinet, ratified by Parliament in 2012, and then formally adopted by the African National Congress at its elective conference in Mangaung 2012, recognizes this problem and says that, therefore, a selection panel should be set up. First of all, that there should be a clear criteria for the National Commissioner, because there aren't any, as you've seen. So the National Policing Board must set the criteria for the National Commissioner, and the selection panel should run a merit-based, competitive, open and transparent process to select the next National Commissioner. So you say, we need a National Commissioner, like we do now, and can we have applications? These are the criteria. You shortlist those people for interviews, maybe 12, and then you, after a transparent process, in other words, you televise the interviews, people can come and watch the interviews like we do with the Public Protector. People can make submissions if they know something about one of the candidates that suggests they shouldn't be the National Commissioner because of their integrity or something like that. So that process means that when the President is given a list of, say, 3 or 5 individuals, men or women, who've gone through quite a rigorous vetting process, he appoints one of those people, and they step into that position with a higher level of authority, both in the public eye and in the police, because we all know why they're being chosen. And they can then start setting the tone for the organization. The National Development Plan then also says there should be an independent assessment of all officers, particularly commissioned officers. In other words, how did those 32 lieutenant generals, how do those 216 major generals get appointed? When are they appointed? Were those posts advertised? What are their skills, capacities, capabilities, and performance in their jobs? And those that are assessed and found were appointed correctly, have the skills and capacity, which there are many, their authority gets enhanced. If they're found that they were appointed for other reasons, the post wasn't advertised, they don't have the requirements to fulfill the function of the post, they'll then move to other posts, and those posts are open and full properly. And then you'll have a top management cohort of people, men and women, that should be there and are able to then take this massive organization and start making sure that the men and women at the grassroots are getting the kind of support, resources that they need in order to do their jobs effectively, and also to further reduce the challenges, the real risks, driving badly, because they'll be able to know what systems are in place. So that is ultimately what we've been calling for. And unfortunately, we heard the Minister of Police say last week, I think it was, that we're on the eve of a new police appointment. And if that's true, because the Minister of Police then said, well, he wants the police strategic planning process to be stopped so that the new appointee can be part of that new strategic planning, that suggests that none of the top managers are going to be chosen, because they would all be part of that strategic planning process, which should have happened last week. So we all wait with bated breath to see again who the President appoints. And of course, that person will immediately be met with suspicion, both inside the police and outside the police. Why is the President appointing that person? What criteria has been used? And then we wait for the scandals to arrive, because there will be a number of people up there who will feel bitter, upset that they weren't chosen, and will probably go out of their way to find the dirt and leak it to the media. And once again, we'll have a National Commissioner who is constantly being in the media for the wrong reasons because of accusations that may or may not be true. And because that process would have made sure that all those accusations could be looked at and tested, and by the time they were, but that's where we're at. Anyway, so I'm going to stop there and just say keep following our campaign. We've got a survey online that you can fill in to say what qualities and characteristics I'd like to see in a police official. And of course, there's the National Commissioner, there's also the head of the Hawks. And there's a lot we want to try and do to try and get people aware of the National Development Plan recommendations and see how they can be effectively implemented. So I'll stop there, and I'll ask, I'm very grateful to have the President of the South African Police Union, Mpho Kunika, who is very much understanding the challenges facing police at all different levels. And he very kindly agreed to come here today to just give his thoughts about what are the key issues, what is a concern to SAPU, and his sort of assessment of policing at the current time, and what he thinks possibly should be done about it. So thanks very much for coming. We're really glad to have you here.
15 minutes to noon. Good day to all of you. And thanks, Gareth, for giving us an opportunity to come and share some of our views with the audience today here. Policing in our country is not in the shape at which it is supposed to be. And it is not true that the police do not have the capacity to do or carry out their constitutional obligation, which is to ensure safety and security to all inhabitants. But what we have seen as a union is the deliberate disabling of the police to do its work. And some of the things which, Gareth, you have raised plays a very crucial role in disabling the police from doing their work. We need ethical leadership. We need leadership which is trusted or trustworthy. Leadership who give information which does not need further translation, because otherwise it gets diluted. But remember, we work in a command and control environment. And if information goes out, it should be carried out as it goes out. When I look at the book written by a colleague here, Andrew, I went through the night. I think I came back from, I wasn't in a province, but when I arrived, 2 o'clock in the morning, the book was delivered at home. And then I said, no, I had to go through this book. And I went through the book. And I think that's the work that you have given us today to look at. If it is wrong, then you tell me it's wrong, then I'll...
You don't have to be one.
So I can leave the book.
Well, up to you. We're very happy to hear your comments on it.
Yeah. Look. Andrew is very strong, and we should support people of his caliber. Policing is a very difficult environment to research in. They hide information. They decide what to give you. And I think Professor Berger will recall at some stage where we went to the police and we insisted that you allow researchers to get into this environment, because they are going to help you unearth issues which you need so that you sharpen policing in our country. There is no way that you want South Africans to trust you if you don't want to keep them in your confidence. Let them know what you're doing, and they will have faith in you. If you make a mistake, they will be able to tell that this is an honest mistake. I am not saying that our men and women in blue should be given a pat behind their backs even when it is not necessary. This is a terrible work that they do. Must remember, they have enormous powers rested in their shoulders. They've got authority to even infringe on the rights of the people anytime. Criminals don't want that right to be infringed upon them. They want to be anywhere, anytime. And the police were then viewed as these people who are playing this role of curtailing their freedom of movement. But there are reasons why their freedom of movement should be curtailed. It is crime. Then we as the union again looked at the entire institution as a whole. But remember the union's role. We create conditions that are conducive for members to can work in. We create labor peace. And we also play an oversight role in policing. And we as the South African Policing Union have put everything aside to make sure that we play this role. And I'll tell you why is it so. It is because once you realize these three issues which I've said, South Africans will be able to get that with the future National Commission of Police. There will be 3 people that are going to be recommended to me by the team of experts. And out of these 3 people, I'll choose one. But that process must be transparent and everybody must be able to see it. Judge Mogoeng was exposed to South Africans, and so terribly, to such an extent that South Africans were so close to getting divided, to say, but why would you ask this person these funny questions? Why would you do I think even himself, he felt that some of the questions posed to him were unfair. But let me say this. Those questions were raised and they needed an answer. If they were not raised in that environment, they will be haunting him today. He responded to each and every question there. And today we have got the best Chief Justice in this country. We need a good National Commission of Police. Commissioner that will undergo the same scrutiny, if not similar. The person whom will be able to ask questions, and that person takes us into confidence. The National Commissioner will not be the National Commissioner of the President of the Republic, but the National Commissioner of the Police. The National Commissioner whom we will all trust. The National Commissioner of whom we, all of us, will have faith in. If you look at all the programs, let me just take you aback and look at the issue of some of the poor police performances which were brought to South Africans, I think, this year. One, the qualified report they've received after 7 years. Qualified report finances forms part of program number 1. And we refer to it as the key performance areas of the National Commission of Police. And there comes the crime stats, damning crime stats. The victim survey, 75% of South Africans, people who went through, the process, people who came face to face with the services of the police saying, we're not happy with what the police are doing. Let me tell you today that some people might be laughing to these issues, but it cannot be those members on the ground, because we hold so dearly this profession. I did not fail somewhere else or make an attempt, go somewhere else to go and look for work. When I left my schooling career, I came straight into policing, because to me, it was a calling. It is an ovation. And that is why I have made sure that anything that I have and I want to know about policy, I throw it into education so that I educate myself, so that I am in a position to be able to service you. But if things goes wrong, it hurts me most. And some of the mistakes that are done by these senior officials in the police and those that are appointing them is that they then start pitting. I heard you talking about this thing of pitting police officials against even the societies that we serve. You look at the Van der Bijl Park issue. You look at the issue of the metro. Religious people, people that are supposed to be showing moral, these people are also so frustrated that they have to start fending for themselves. If I say that the conditions under which police officials find themselves working in is not conducive for them to can work in, I think you will agree with me. Every day, these junior police officers who are in the cold face of fighting crime becomes the victims of the anger of the society that is very angry towards a government system, the government that is not able to respond to their issues. Now, the first person that goes to them is the police officer. And that anger is then shown to those people. Now, we need to stand up as the union now and say, you can't be assaulted, you can't be killed, continue to be killed when you are carrying the equipment given to you to defend your life so that you're in a position to defend the lives of the others and their properties. Because that is the fundamental principle that you apply before you utilize, you activate Section 49, which is the use of force when effecting a lawful arrest. So, when I looked at your book, it was so courageous. It encouraged me and my colleagues, and I have been, I spoke to them and I said, please go and look at this book. It speaks to your issues. It speaks to your lives. At least there are people outside there who have taken painful decisions to get into this environment, to unearth the problems which you are faced with on a daily basis. And we from the South African Policing Union want to take this opportunity and thank you. Thank you, Andrew. The issues which we have picked up in that book, which we feel strongly that we need to